And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today with El Salvador, where for the second time in a week, a prominent anti-gold mining activist has been assassinated. On Saturday, 32-year-old Dora Alicia Recinos Sorto was shot dead near her home. She was 8 months pregnant, carrying her 2-year-old son. Sorto and her husband were both active members of the Cabañas Environment Committee, which has campaigned against the reopening of a gold mine owned by the Vancouver-based Pacific Rim Mining Company. Last week, Ramiro Rivera Gomez, the vice president of the Cabañas Environment Committee, was shot dead by heavily armed men despite having been under 24-hour police protection. Another anti-gold mining activist, Marcelo Rivera, from a nearby town, was kidnapped and murdered in June. For more on the situation in El Salvador, I'm joined in Boston by Alexis Stumbelas. She's the executive director of CISPACE, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. Alexis, welcome to Democracy Now! What's happening?
Well, thanks for having me, Amy. As you mentioned, the spate of violence has happened and has increased very urgently within the last week. What the people of Cabañas are facing right now is a really serious crisis surrounding the opposition to this gold mine proposed by Pacific Rim. And over the last several years, this opposition to the mine has been increasing. Ramiro Rivera, who you mentioned, was killed last week, and the husband of Alicia Sorto, who was killed just this past weekend, were both very outspoken leaders against a new mining project proposed in Nueva Trinidad, where they lived. And what's really remarkable about the case in El Salvador right now is how effective the mining resistance has been over the last 4 to 5 years. And through community education, through mobilization, through street blockades, the movement really has effectively stopped Pacific Rim from being able to start any mining projects in El Salvador. And this is really a tremendous victory. But as we've seen, historically in El Salvador and many other places in the world, that when the resistance movement becomes so effective, that's when this kind of targeted violence happens. And so what it appears to be right now is a very systematic attempt to eliminate the leadership of a very effective community resistance movement.
Can you give us the picture of the map in El Salvador? Exactly where this gold mine is? Was it operating? What is the Vancouver company saying about this?
Well, the mining projects are proposed in the northern part of the region, a department called Cabañas, and it's a very rural part of the country. It's very densely populated. Most of the people who live there are agrarian farmers, cattle ranchers, and their biggest concerns really have been environmental. Pacific Rim owns a mine called El Dorado, which is near the community of San Isidro, where Marcelo Rivera lived and was organizing. And they also have several other proposed mining projects in the area, for example, in Nueva Trinidad, where Ramiro Rivera and Alicia Sorto are from. So the mines have not been in operation at any point because the communities have been so effective in their resistance, and the government of El Salvador has denied the permits to actually start extracting gold. A few years ago, the Pacific Rim was doing exploratory drilling in El Dorado, and the community's experience of that, seeing their rivers dry up and seeing their crops and cattle die, was part of the initial motivation to start organizing. And since then, through the kinds of street protests and sort of physical confrontations with the companies that people like Ramiro Rivera have been leading, Pacific Rim really had to walk away from the project, and they basically ceased operations there in 2008. Pacific Rim hasn't said anything yet about these 2 recent assassinations this week, but it's pretty clear that the continued presence of the company there, despite widespread community opposition and despite their permits having been denied years ago, that the company's continued presence and continuing to push for this mine is really creating a climate of violence there.
Can you explain how the Pacific Rim, the mining company from Vancouver, ties into CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Association?
Yeah. This is really one of the key issues, because Pacific Rim applied for mining permits, and they were denied on the basis of their environmental impact study that didn't pass muster in El Salvador, and that was in 2005, 2006. But just this past year, Pacific Rim filed a lawsuit through CAFTA, the U.S. Central American Free Trade Agreement, suing the Salvadoran government for, at the minimum, $77 million, claiming that this is money that they've lost in their investment, or money, potential profits that they could have made had they been granted the permits. And they are going through CAFTA, which is the U.S. Central American Free Trade Agreement. And the only way that they're able to do this, because Pacific Rim is located in Vancouver, is that they acquired a subsidiary in Nevada in 2007. And through that U.S. subsidiary, they are taking advantage of the very generous and expansive corporate rights that are built into CAFTA. CAFTA has a Chapter 11, which is Chapter 10, which is very similar to NAFTA's Chapter 11 around quote-unquote investment rights, which really is a chapter that gives transnational corporations tremendous legal access to the natural resources of the countries in Central America and in Mexico, and defines investors with more rights, literally, to land and to water than even local or national governments have. And so the basis of Pacific Rim's lawsuit is that they didn't get these permits, even though the Salvadoran government has every right to give or not give mining permits based on what the impact will be. And in this case, because Pacific Rim is going to use, or proposing to use, cyanide extraction, presents a tremendous health and environmental danger to the community. So the really central issue here is about sovereignty. Does El Salvador, do the other countries in Central America have the right to enforce their own environmental laws, or do transnational corporations get to rule?
Alexis Stambelis, even before these latest murders, a large number of human rights groups, including your organization, the Committee on the People of El Salvador, the American Jewish World Service, American Solidarity Organization, and many others, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Clinton. What are you demanding?
Well, the United States El Salvador is extremely dependent in many ways still on the United States. El Salvador, having been governed for the last 20 years by the right-wing Arena Party, has been one of the United States' closest allies in Latin America over the past 20 years. And what is really necessary right now is for these murders to be investigated, not just on a superficial level of trying to find, the gunmen, but really going beyond that to investigate the intellectual authors behind these murders. They are very systematic. They are very targeted. And what we've seen, as you mentioned with Ramiro Rivera, he was under 24-hour police protection. So the people who are responsible for this, who are calling the shots or who are making this happen, must have a pretty extensive amount of financial resources or institutional resources. And so it's going beyond just chalking this up to common crime or gang-related violence. And CISPAS, along with a lot of other organizations in the U.S. and Canada, has been putting pressure both on the Salvadoran government directly, on the Attorney General of El Salvador, to really investigate these as politically motivated assassinations and to stop the impunity that is allowing these assassinations to continue. But it's also really critical to put that pressure on the United States, which is so deeply involved, over-involved in El Salvador's internal governance. And
you're calling on a new U.S. ambassador to be sent to El Salvador?
Well, there are. President Obama recently did announce a new U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, which will be a welcome change, we hope. But what we really need to see is both U.S. we need to see support from the United States to respecting and supporting El Salvador's internal and independent processes by which they are really going to investigate police corruption, where they're really going to potentially, and we hope, expose whatever networks are behind these kinds of targeted and systematic assassinations. And, you know, it's not for the United States to intervene in those investigations, but rather to respect El Salvador's independent process of doing so and provide the support that El Salvador may be calling for.
And the significance of the new president, you talked about a reign of ruling for years, Mauricio Funes, and what is he demanding right now, especially when this latest murder of Dora, with the wounding of her 2-year-old son, she was 8 months pregnant on the way back from the laundry?